Ladies and gentlemen, if you think trade diplomacy is a polite handshake, tea and speeches, think again. Because what India is about to do by sending its trade minister to Washington is not about pleasantries. It's about pressure. It's about power. And make no mistake, the eyes of business, government, and every exporter are locked on what happens next. Piyush Goyal lands in the U.S. on September 22 amid a storm of tariffs, trade threats, and headline-grabbing pauses in exports. Just weeks ago, U.S. officials hit Indian goods with a 50% tariff. Yes, 50%, citing everything from trade imbalances to India's continued purchase of Russian oil. The Times of India 4 Reuters 4 Business Standard 4. It was a move that left Indian exporters reeling, businesses counting losses, and politicians scrambling for response. And then came the talks, a U.S. delegation in New Delhi led by Brendan Lynch, India under Rajesh Agrawal. Both sides described the discussions as positive and forward-looking. TV come to Reuters too, but positive is a fast-moving word in trade wars, because behind it lie demands and concessions, demanding India open its agriculture and dairy sectors. India pushing back, protect its farmers, US saying reduce Russian oil imports, India saying energy security and global market realities complicate that ask. Reuters 2 Business Standard 2 What's at stake? For starters, livelihoods. Indian exporters are already seeing revenue drop from about $8 billion in July to $6.86 billion in August to the US market. Fox Business to Reuters Plus 2 Technology sector worries about visa fee hikes. Agricultural sector fears of US goods flooding the Indian market. And both countries know there's reputational risk. Can India be seen as open but fair? Can the US be seen as wielding tariffs like blunt instruments? And yet, despite all the friction, despite the fears, there's momentum. The Indian government has clearly signaled it wants a deal, early, perhaps by late November. Business Standard 1. The talks may be tough, the demands may be hard, but both sides seem to agree on one thing. Continuing down this path of tariffs and retaliation is bad for business, bad for growth, bad for trust. The ongoing tariff conflict between India and the United States is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it is about political will, national pride, and the harsh realities of a global economy increasingly shaped by rivalry rather than partnership. At the heart of this tension is Washington's decision to slap steep tariffs on a wide range of Indian goods, in some cases as high as 50%. The stated justification has ranged from balancing trade deficits to punishing India for continuing its energy partnership with Russia, but the impact is far more tangible than the diplomatic rhetoric suggests. For Indian exporters, particularly in sectors like textiles, steel, and chemicals, these tariffs are a body blow. Many businesses were already operating on slim margins in a fiercely competitive global market, and now they find themselves priced out of the very market they once relied on most. Behind the curtain of official statements lies a reality that is deeply unsettling. In July, Indian exports to the US were valued at around $8 billion, but by August that figure had dropped to nearly $6.86 billion. That is not a dip, it is a sharp fall, one that sends shockwaves through supply chains, affects employment, and rattles investor confidence. Export associations in India are voicing alarm, warning that sustained tariffs at this level could destroy smaller enterprises and limit India's capacity to compete globally. The pain is immediate, but the long-term implications may be even more severe, as companies hesitate to invest in scaling up production for a market where access is now uncertain. The US, meanwhile, insists that its measures are about fairness. Officials argue that India has enjoyed preferential access to American markets while restricting imports in sensitive areas like agriculture and dairy. They point to India's refusal to open its domestic market to certain American goods and insist that tariffs are a way to level the playing field. Yet critics see this less as fairness and more as arm twisting, a way to pressure New Delhi into policy changes that suit Washington's economic and strategic interests. The Russia angle is particularly contentious. The US has made no secret of its displeasure at India's continued purchase of discounted Russian crude oil. By tying punitive trade measures to this energy relationship, Washington is essentially turning tariffs into a geopolitical weapon. For India, the dilemma is acute. On one hand, access to the American market is crucial, especially for high-value exports. On the other, bending too easily risks being seen as capitulation, something New Delhi is keen to avoid. The government has so far struck a tone of cautious optimism, emphasizing that ongoing talks are positive and forward-looking. But optimism cannot erase the structural disadvantages tariffs impose. Every container stuck at customs, every order cancelled due to higher costs, becomes a reminder that economic sovereignty is at stake. This tariff conflict is therefore more than a trade dispute. It is a test of endurance, of diplomatic skill, and of how far each side is willing to go in defending its economic interests. India knows that a prolonged standoff could hurt growth, but it also recognizes that succumbing to pressure could undermine its credibility as a rising global power. The United States, for its part, risks alienating one of its most important strategic partners in Asia at a time when global alliances are fragile and competition with China is intensifying. Both sides have much to lose, and the pressure is mounting with every passing month. Amid the heightened tensions of tariffs and trade restrictions, the very fact that India and the United States are sitting across the table and describing their talks as positive is in itself a sign of renewed momentum. Diplomacy often moves at a glacial pace, yet the urgency with which both governments are now engaging shows that neither side can afford prolonged friction. When American negotiators led by Brendan Lynch met their Indian counterparts under Rajesh Agrawal, the discussions were not marked by public posturing or fiery rhetoric. Instead, the tone was pragmatic, forward-looking, and designed to find a way out of a spiral that could easily escalate into a full-blown trade war. This renewed dialogue has significance far beyond the language of joint press releases. Trade relationships between India and the U.S. underpin tens of billions of dollars in goods and services, with entire sectors depending on smoother access to each other's markets. Positive talks suggest that Washington recognizes the risks of overplaying tariffs, and New Delhi acknowledges the need for compromise in areas where flexibility is possible. The impending visit of India's Trade Minister Piyush Goyal to Washington adds weight to this momentum. His presence is not symbolic, it signals a readiness to negotiate at the highest political level, where decisions are not just bureaucratic but strategic. One of the most telling signs of progress is the shift in tone from outright confrontation to cautious optimism. In trade diplomacy, words matter because they frame expectations. When both sides describe their interactions as constructive, it hints at areas where tentative understandings may already be forming. Observers suggest that technical-level talks are moving toward frameworks that could ease some tariffs while outlining reciprocal concessions. For instance, India could explore incremental openings in sectors like agriculture without undermining its domestic producers, while the U.S. could provide relief on tariffs that are crippling Indian exporters in key industries. Momentum also comes from external realities. For Washington, escalating disputes with India could fracture an important strategic partnership at a time when the U.S. is seeking allies to counterbalance China. For New Delhi, sustaining access to American markets is vital for exporters, particularly in textiles, pharmaceuticals, and IT services. Both sides are aware that cooperation is not optional, it is necessary. That realization alone injects urgency into the current round of negotiations. The upcoming ministerial-level engagement is therefore less about diplomacy for show and more about hammering out real solutions. There is also a recognition of the domestic pressures each side faces. The Indian government cannot be seen as compromising too much, especially on sensitive issues like dairy and agriculture. The U.S. administration, likewise, cannot appear weak on tariffs at a time when protectionism appeals to its political base. Positive talks in this context mean that both sides are working to find creative formulas that allow each government to claim success without being seen as conceding ground. This delicate balancing act is what makes the renewed momentum so vital. Ultimately, the encouraging aspect is not that every issue has been resolved, but that the channels of communication are open, active, and moving forward. Tariff conflicts may have triggered the crisis, but the willingness to return to the negotiating table shows that both India and the US understand the higher stakes involved. Positive momentum does not guarantee an immediate breakthrough, but it does suggest that neither side is prepared to walk away. In an era where trade disputes can quickly escalate into broader political rifts, this renewed dialogue offers a rare glimpse of pragmatism and the possibility of turning confrontation into cooperation. Among the most difficult sticking points in the ongoing India-U.S. trade discussions are three sensitive areas: Russian oil imports and the opening of India's agriculture and dairy markets. These issues cut to the core of both economic and political interests, making them far more complex than routine trade disagreements. Each represents a test of sovereignty, resilience, and the limits of compromise in a relationship that is otherwise touted as strategic and indispensable. The matter of Russian oil looms particularly large. India has significantly increased its imports of discounted Russian crude since the Ukraine conflict began, arguing that as a developing nation with pressing energy demands, it must prioritize affordability and security of supply. For India, Russian oil has been an economic lifeline, easing inflationary pressures and ensuring stable fuel availability. Yet for Washington, these purchases are a direct challenge to its sanctions regime and its broader strategy of isolating Moscow. By linking tariffs on Indian goods to continued Russian imports, the US is effectively leveraging trade tools for geopolitical ends. This puts New Delhi in a tough spot. Capitulating would expose it to energy insecurity, while resisting risk deeper economic pain through tariffs and possible curbs on market access. India's stance so far has been to emphasize diversification without committing to drastic reductions, signaling that its energy policy will not be dictated from outside. Agriculture is another flashpoint. The United States has long pressed India to open its markets to American farm products, from cereals and pulses to processed foods. U.S. producers argue that India's high tariffs and regulatory barriers make access nearly impossible, undermining the principle of fair trade. India, however, has consistently resisted such demands, citing the vulnerability of its farmers, many of whom operate at subsistence levels. Opening the floodgates to cheap American imports could devastate local agricultural communities, sparking social unrest and political backlash. For the Indian government, agriculture is not just an economic sector, it is the backbone of rural livelihoods and a critical pillar of food security. Conceding too much in this domain risks destabilizing entire regions and alienating millions of voters. The dairy industry adds yet another layer of complexity. The U.S. dairy lobby has been particularly vocal about gaining entry into India, one of the world's largest markets for milk and milk products. Yet India's dairy sector is unlike that of most countries. It is dominated by small-scale farmers, often women in rural households, who rely on cooperative models for survival. Opening the sector to large-scale U.S. dairy producers could crush these fragile ecosystems. Furthermore, cultural and religious sensitivities around dairy products, especially those linked to cattle, make the issue politically explosive. For India, protecting its dairy sector is about much more than economics. It is tied to tradition, identity, and rural stability. What makes these areas especially contentious is that they touch both domestic vulnerabilities and international expectations. The US frames them as trade fairness and market access. India frames them as sovereignty, livelihood, and security. Neither side can simply compromise without paying a heavy price at home. As a result, these three issues, Russian oil, agriculture, and dairy, are likely to remain the thorniest hurdles in negotiations. They encapsulate the larger dilemma of India-US relations: how to balance strategic partnership with deeply conflicting national interests. Each round of talks may produce incremental progress elsewhere, but unless these core disputes are addressed with creativity and respect for sensitivities, they will continue to cast a long shadow over the trade agenda. The impact of the current tariff regime on Indian exports and market access has been both immediate and severe, underscoring how vulnerable even a large and diversified economy can be to sudden shifts in trade policy. For decades, The United States has been one of India's most important export destinations, absorbing a wide range of goods from textiles and apparel to pharmaceuticals, steel, chemicals, and IT services. This reliance means that any disruption in access to the American market reverberates across industries and affects millions of livelihoods. The imposition of tariffs as high as 50% on certain categories of Indian goods has already begun to take a measurable toll, with export figures showing sharp declines. In July, exports to the US were valued at roughly $8 billion. By August, that figure had dropped to just under $7 billion. The steep fall is not merely a temporary fluctuation, but rather a reflection of structural barriers now confronting Indian exporters. For Indian businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, the sudden spike in tariffs is a devastating blow. These companies typically operate on thin margins, and when the cost of their goods increases dramatically in the US market, they lose their competitive edge almost overnight. Buyers in America, faced with higher prices, are quick to turn to alternative suppliers from other countries, leaving Indian exporters stranded with unsold inventory and reduced contracts. The textile and apparel sector has been among the hardest hit, as it faces intense competition from countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam, which now enjoy a price advantage. Similarly, manufacturers of steel and chemical products are grappling with declining orders, threatening thousands of jobs. Beyond immediate losses, the uncertainty created by these tariffs is eroding long-term confidence. Exporters are hesitant to invest in expanding production or exploring new product lines when they cannot be sure of stable access to their biggest market. This hesitancy dampens growth, reduces innovation, and curtails India's ambition to climb further up the value chain in global trade. The information technology sector, though less directly impacted by tariffs on physical goods, is feeling the strain from parallel issues such as rising visa fees and tightening immigration policies, which threaten its ability to deploy skilled professionals to the US market. Together, these factors form a web of challenges that undermine India's broader export-driven growth strategy. The consequences extend to India's standing in the global marketplace as well. If Indian exporters lose ground in the US, regaining market share later will be difficult, even if tariffs are eventually rolled back. Trade relationships often depend on reliability, and once buyers shift supply chains to other countries, inertia works against reversing those decisions. At the same time, the tariff conflict raises questions about India's access to new markets and its ability to diversify away from dependence on the US. This places pressure on policymakers to accelerate negotiations with Europe, Southeast Asia, and other partners, but such shifts take years to yield results. In the short term, the weight of the crisis falls squarely on exporters themselves. Associations are warning of job cuts, factory closures, and an erosion of competitiveness if the situation continues. The longer the tariffs remain in place, the deeper the scars will run, not just in balance sheets but also in the confidence of India's export sector. Market access to the US is not simply about trade volume, it is about credibility, trust, and the ability of Indian goods to be part of global supply chains. The current restrictions therefore represent a threat, not just to trade figures, but to India's broader economic aspirations. So here's what you should watch closely. Will the US tone down its demand on Russian oil? Will India open up its dairy agriculture in ways that preserve its own producers? Will there be tariff relief for exporters, or at least a roadmap? And most crucially, can this become a model of diplomacy that wins without conceding too much? Because if done right, this isn't just a trade deal. It's a statement India will stand firm, negotiate boldly, but will not be coerced. It's a test of whether global trade can be reset for the 21st century, not through dominance but through fairness. Thank you for staying with me through this, because what happens in Washington next could reshape economies, industries, and lives far beyond the headlines.